This is a good question. I find a lot of people tend to, one, over tighten either their cinch or their girth from the start, but two, I find that the amount of tension that they're using or that they think that they need to use often is far too much as far as for the comfort of the horse, but it occurs because most of the time people's tack don't actually fit their horse correctly. So if we have a saddle that seems like it's slipping, if we have a horse that maybe has very low withers and is difficult to fit, maybe he's very wide in the shoulder, maybe long in the back, there could be all kinds of different things. And this doesn't matter if it's English or Western tack or equipment that's used. I find a lot of folks just kind of try and fix it by either filling things up with more pads or saddle blankets and tightening the cinch quite tight or the girth quite tight. This does not prevent slipping, tipping, or otherwise if your saddle does not fit correctly. So as part of the assessment to say, well, how tight should my saddle be? The first part is does your saddle fit? The second part is noticing what your horse's behaviors are during the tacking up. So if you are dealing with a horse that maybe has a past of ill-fitting tack and equipment, and so there's a bit of defensiveness about being tacked up, or he still carries maybe mental anticipation, which translates to physical tension when you're about to tack up, you may find that he winds up holding his breath, and so his barrel is enlarged, and so you have to wind up tightening up in slow, separate stages. But part of this is helping that horse learn to let down or let go of his tension, being able to move his head, his neck, his jaw, his shoulders, his knees, his barrel, and his hindquarters, all separate from one another as a way to diffuse the brace or the physical tension before you then add more pressure. Now, I remember years and years ago, actually decades ago, the old way was tighten up either your cinch or your girth, reach forward for the front leg, draw it out in front of the horse, like lifting it off the ground to try and stretch so that you weren't pinching skin behind the horse's front legs. But the reality is most of these horses were actually carrying tension all the time that we just didn't notice. Or another one was tighten it some, let your horse walk, and then tighten it more. Now, the problem with a horse who's maybe mentally anticipative because of previous discomfort associated with tack is if you're just walking the horse around, you're not actually going to diffuse his tension. So that's why checking in, breaking down each of the body parts separately in segments to help that horse let go of the tension before you tighten up the cinch or the girth will give the horse a new experience, which teaches him in the future he doesn't have to anticipate, he doesn't have to brace and get tight or enlarge his barrel area. We have the F-18s flying overhead. So another part to look at is if your saddle is fitting correctly and if you are tightening the cinch or the girth, is noticing that if your horse is soft, and let's say from wherever you're tacking up to wherever you're going to mount, and you have moved your horse to walk some, or even moving around loose in a round pen, or whatever it is that you're doing, notice if there's been an adjustment of the saddle. I find a lot of people who tell me, including many saddle fitters, that a saddle fits the horse, and I look at the horse and I watch the horse move and I watch the horse put the tack on them. Unfortunately, much of the time the tack is not fitting horses correctly. And so if you watch with kind of slow, we'll say low energy movement, notice if there's any shifting or tipping in your tack. This is also going to tell you why it feels like you have to keep tightening and tightening and tightening, because when you're sitting in it, if it's already shifting without you, you can only imagine by the time you're in the saddle what it's going to feel like, especially like when you go to make a tight turn or anything like that, and the horse's shoulders fold around, you'll often feel that saddle tip, if it's unstable, usually like the opposite way, or it might feel like it's sliding forward or sliding backwards. And so people, will keep tightening the cinch or the girth. So again, look at these pieces. Now, as far as if you actually did have a tack or saddle that was fitting your horse correctly, by the time you're done tightening it, I always say you should barely be able to slide in if your hand is flat in between the horse's side and the cinch or the girth. Now, something else to notice and to think about is what are you using as far as the kind of cinch or girth, because if you took, let's say, an English girth that had elastic on both ends, there'd be a whole lot more give. If you have a cinch, I'm seeing a lot of them now, I don't particularly care for them, but they're very padded up, so it's almost like an inch thick material, whether it's wool or anything else, There's, again, different materials made out of plastics that I find irritate a lot of horses, but all of these different factors also affect as far as how much compression is happening in the actual cinch, plus how much give there is from where it's attached on the saddle. So there's a variety of things that we need to look at in order to assess. So if you started with we'll say the basic of, okay, my horse is soft, I'm tightening the saddle multiple times before I get on, I can barely slide my hand in between his barrel and not underneath on the bottom side, and not way up high where your leg is. Everyone always reaches way up high, I'm not sure why. And then we're checking in, and then as we get on and we're just sitting there, reach down with your hand and notice if there's a lot that loosened up. Something to assess is if you are trying to fix perhaps less than ideal tack fitting or saddle fitting issues by adding more pads. When you are sitting in the saddle, you're now compressing. If you're building up things with a lot of pads, you're now compressing that, and so that's going to create a give and a loosening of or feels like a loosening of the cinch also, or girth. So again, you got to look at all these different pieces because that's going to affect the ideal outcome. It should not look like there's indentations on the horse's sides from like in specific areas. I see a lot of times in especially English girths that people are using the wrong size, and so as far as the length of the girth, and so where the buckles are attaching to those girths on either side of the saddle, I'm finding a lot of times it's either very, very low or very high up. And we don't want to create, pressures and so on. So I always say if you go behind the horse's shoulder, straight back, and then go down about 2 to 3 inches, again, depends on the individual horse and breed and size and build. But a lot of people have stuff like hiked way, way up because the girths are too long or too short. And then same thing with cinches. The other thing I'm going to mention about back cinches on a Western saddle is if your saddle doesn't fit right, just because you have the cinch tight and just because you crank down on the back cinch doesn't mean your saddle's going to fit any better. It may feel like you are perhaps slightly more stable in the saddle, but I find most people wind up using a back cinch and they're not really sure why they're using it. They're not roping, they're not, they just kind of like, it came with the saddle, so I'm using it. And for a lot of folks, they tend to leave a huge gap with that back cinch, which can allow the possibility, if your horse takes a misstep or has whatever issues, that they can actually reach forward with their hind leg and get it hooked up under that back cinch, especially if they have shoes on. So we want to make sure that that back cinch is nice and snug. I see a lot of people riding with it dangling down and swinging all over the place and so on. But just because you have a back cinch doesn't mean you're any more stable if your saddle is not fitting correctly. So just some thoughts.